Okay, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Office of State Procurement's Contract Closeout Procedure Training class. Hopefully everyone's in here. My name is Blake Lochley, and I will be presenting today with my colleague, Andrew Guzzardo. Today we'll start by saying contract closeout is a simple, but it's often overlooked part of the contract management process. For today's training, we're going to hope to answer the following questions. What is contract closeout, and what is its role in contract management? When exactly should contract closeout occur? Why contract closeout is important, and what are some potential benefits of having a procedure in place? And finally, we will be discussing how OSP currently internally manages contract closeout to serve as an example that hopefully you can take from and possibly apply to your own contracts and procurements. So, what exactly is contract closeout, and what does it do? So at its base level, contract closeout is the final action taken in the contract management process that at its conclusion ends with the physical closing of the contract file and its removal from active management. What an effective contract procedure does is verify that all of the terms of a contract have been met, all administrative actions have been completed, all disputes are settled, and final payment has been made. It can also serve as an opportunity to review the file in its totality, which can serve a variety of purposes, such as making sure all procurement, regulations, contract management procedures, and any other required internal policies and procedures have been followed along the way. Basically, in a nutshell, you can consider contract closeout procedure as the opportunity and the means by which you can make sure that all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed in regards to a contract before it is closed and stored away. So, when is a contract actually ready to be closed? I think most people would probably guess that it must be when the actual contract period expires. However, this is not necessarily the case. There can be often several scenarios which may delay your ability to fully close out a contract despite the contract itself being expired. So next we'll go through some things that must be absolutely true and must be verified before a contract closure can be finalized. First, we must confirm that all of the services have been satisfactorily performed and all products have been delivered or accepted. This is the overall big one that all of the points that follow ultimately fall under. However, if we look at this simply from a have all deliverables or services been completed perspective, we must first say that this is something that will need to be verified both internally with your own agency as well as externally with the vendor. Something or a good example as a possibility that may extend the process beyond contract expiration is upon talking to the vendor, you may discover that there's a long lead time item that won't be deliverable for several weeks, or that some service may still be rendered, and therefore you will have to hold out the contract closeout until that is completed. Obviously, we, for our own selves and our own obligations, must verify that our payment has been made. We should also make sure that if there were any issues such as deficiency complaints, that they were satisfactorily resolved as all parties. It can be something like an official deficiency complaint that was kind of discussed in some of the previous trainings, or it may just be something that needs to be made right between you and the vendor, replacement products, that sort of thing. We must also confirm that any contractually required documents, reports, records have been provided. This may vary between agency and between contract. An example that we often track would be things like usage. It could be things like expense reports, that sort of thing. Anything outside of the normal deliverables of the contract that are also written into the contract that they must provide, we want to make sure that those have been turned in. Finally, we want to verify that any property inventory or any other ownership-related issues have been resolved. Some examples may include maybe it's a rental contract, we've rented some equipment, so we'd want to verify with the vendor that they've received everything they expect back from us, maybe not just the equipment, maybe sometimes there's connections or other things that we could be charged for, anything outstanding like that. We just want to make sure that they understand that we've returned everything. Maybe we provided some type of die, a cast, or proprietary logo in regards to the contract that we need to make sure to get back from the vendor at the conclusion of the contract. Also, maybe the vendor stores inventory at your site or facility, and at the conclusion of the contract, the inventory needs to be returned to the vendor. These are all types of things, property related, that we want to make sure have taken place before we actually go through in the contract. So as you can see, there can be several things that need to be taken care of outside of the contract simply expiring that will ensure a satisfactory and conclusive contract closeout. So finally, I'll go over why having an effective contract closeout is important and can be beneficial. We've touched on this in a roundabout way, but by following a defined procedure that covers all points on the previous slides, we ensure that not only the vendors have fulfilled their obligations, but ourselves as well. This process is not just about a conclusion to the contract, but a satisfactory conclusion to all parties involved. Once we've gone through this process of verification that everything with the contract is resolved and complete, you can confidently go through a final review of the file, in addition to making sure that obligations were fulfilled. They may potentially reveal things such as it may reduce audit findings. If you take the time to do a final self-audit of the file, you can make sure that everything is in order, that no steps in the procurement process were skipped, all the documentation was there, anything that may be looked for or frowned upon. It's your final opportunity to make sure and bring those issues to light and hopefully find a way to rectify them if, God forbid, at this point we find that there's an issue. During closure, you make sure that all outstanding POs are accounted for, so it should reveal things such as orders that may need to be canceled, or remaining balances that need to be adjusted for on things like blanket orders. So by going through this whole process and looking at all of the POs, it can possibly ensure that any outstanding funds that are encumbered will be unencumbered in as timely a fashion as possible. Finally, it can be used as a time to assess the overall success of the contract. We can look at things like were there any lessons learned that can be possibly used on future contracts. Some examples that I can think of include, looking at things like usage, did we use as much product as we thought we would? Did we use the contract less than we thought, more than we thought? Things like this can influence quantities we may list on future procurements, or is the contract even viable? Was it a contract that we need to carry forward? Looking at things like issues, deficiencies, that sort of thing. Was there a problem with the vendor? Is there a reason that we may not want to look at them in any future contracts? Looking at the contract for potential issues with terms and conditions. Were there issues with deliveries? Were there things that we don't need on the contract, things that we wish we had? This is a time where you have everything that is in relation to the contract, so it's your opportunity to kind of encapsulate that and hopefully use that going forward. Last but not least, providing employees a clear and defined closeout process gives them a finish line. They will know that once this process is done, that, hey, I no longer have to actively worry about this particular file on a day-to-day basis. It lets them know what's active and outstanding on their desk that they can focus on. So going forward now, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Andrew, to go through how OSP currently goes through a contract closeout process.
All right, as Blake said, I'm going to take us over how we at OSP do the contract closeout procedures. When do we start? At OSP, we typically start 30 days prior to the final expiration of the contract. This can vary depending on the contract and the complexity of it. If it's a long lead time item, some things may take a little longer. Starting early will allow us for any issues that may have come up to be addressed in a timely manner. So how does OSP begin? At OSP, the beginning of the process starts by a SPA emailing a closeout notification letter to the vendor. The letter will typically cover official notification of the contract end date, notification of any outstanding reporting requirements, documents, etc., and requested due date. It also will request that the contractor notify us of any issues and when the issues will be resolved. So what else is required for contract closeout at OSP? The SPAs complete a contract closeout checklist that ensure that the following has been verified. The file must be organized per OSP's internal policy, contain all required documentation, all POs and invoices were submitted and paid, any outstanding issues resolved, all outstanding reports, documents, etc. have been received, contract performance evaluation received from the agency or agencies, all property or information returned to the appropriate parties. Have the commodities or services been rebid, or is there intent to do so? By this point in the process, you typically know if you're going to rebid that contract or commodity. Once you have all that done, we're going to route the contract closeout. Once the SPA verifies that all the required items on the checklist is complete, they'll route to the appropriate management personnel for final closeout approval. Upon the final approval, a supervisor will close out the contract in LeGov and return the file to the SPA. After the file is returned to the SPA, the following should occur. Analysts should recheck that the file is organized properly. They should then give the complete contract file to their admin so that it can be filed and stored in the file room. So we do have another presentation after this, but if at this time you have any questions regarding contract closeout or how OSP handles contract closeout, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Blake and Andrew. I am Christy Bowen. I will be presenting on contract kickoff meetings today with Austin Bachman. So, we've got a few objectives for you all at the end of this course. We want you to be able to describe the purpose of each section of the kickoff agenda. We want you to know how to plan a contract kickoff meeting and how to determine the project roles and responsibilities. So, why? Don't freak out on us and go, oh no, I don't want another meeting. I'm already busy enough. These meetings are not designed to add to your workload. They're actually designed to mitigate the potential for issues and problems during contract performance. And at the end of your contract term, these meetings can result in a decreased workload during that term. They are a benefit to you. Now, you want to hold these meetings prior to contract performance start. You'll probably hold them in person or in the current time, most likely via a teleconference or webinar. But the type of the meeting that you hold is going to depend on the complexity and value of the contract or even the risks associated with the contract. It might also depend on the location of your contractor and where your agency staff are. These contract kickoff meetings may even be held in conjunction with a project kickoff, implementation, startup, or planning meeting that the contractor requests. You want to include your agency and contractor staff and meet with your supervisor or manager to determine their attendance or the attendance of anyone else at your agency, at OSP, or at another using agency. Be sure to include anyone involved in or working on the contract. During these meetings, you're going to cover contractual requirements such as timelines, quality, delivery, and contractual remedies. You want to be sure that you achieve a clear and mutual understanding of the work to be done and who will complete the work. You're going to set the foundation for good communication and clear expectations. So, we created 3 new documents related to contract kickoff meetings. We've got template instructions, the actual contract kickoff meeting agenda, and a project roles and responsibilities table. These documents will be located at procurement.la.gov and found by clicking on Agency Center and then Agency Forms. So, for the template instructions, these are going to detail each section of the kickoff meeting agenda. Now, when you look at these instructions, they're 4 pages long. Don't stress about that because most of the information in the instructions is examples or guidance to help you when you go to fill out the agenda. And then keep in mind too, there's no expectation that you go through these instructions every single time you fill out the agenda. Refer to them the first few times as needed, and once you have a hang of it, just go back if you need a refresher. So on the next few slides, we're going to walk through the actual kickoff meeting agenda. We're going to use a pretend staff augmentation contract. That's where the state would potentially hire in outside contractors to help supplement the staff in-house, or maybe they're hired in to do specialty work. So keep in mind while you're looking at the examples we'll show you, they are not comprehensive. So the kickoff meeting agenda. The individual that's responsible for the contract of the agency is going to complete this agenda. It might be the contract monitor, it could also be a project manager. If you have a lot of contracts that are kind of similar, that you're inviting some of the same people, you might even lean towards creating a partially completed agenda that you edit the pertinent information as needed. So the agenda is set up as a fillable form and it has expandable fields so you can enter as much information as needed. Be sure you use Adobe Acrobat and not Adobe Reader if it's available to you, just so that you can actually save the form without having to print it to PDF or physically printing it. So you're going to fill in, sorry about that, the contract name, the meeting date, time, and location. And if you're holding a webinar or conference call, put that information in the location box. Add all of your meeting attendees and their contact information. And you can also use the Add Row and Delete Row button to add more rows as needed. There's no limit on how many you can add. And be sure during the meeting to check off whether or not people were present.
So on our sample, you'll see that we have a contract title at the top, and then we have filled out our meeting date and time, along with the location of the meeting and conference call information. We've also added the attendees, and we've used the Add Row feature at the bottom to add additional rows because the default setting on the agenda only has space for 4 attendees, and our meeting is going to have 8 attendees.
So then the next section on the agenda is going to be the purpose section. It's going to include a high-level overview of the goals and objectives for the meeting. Now, this is the one section where the text color in the agenda in the sample box is actually defaulted to black instead of a blue. That's because that is the one section that can, it does not have to, but it can stay as is. We want to be very specific with that section because it explicitly states that we're not making changes to the contract in the meeting, and that the contract terms are not going to be renegotiated during the meeting either. So for our sample,
we've added a little bit more detail to the purpose, but we've kept this sentence about no changes being made to the contract.
So after the purpose, we'll go into the introduction of key personnel. This is the second section. You want to take this time to actually introduce each member of the team who's working on the contract. You want to explain those individuals' roles and responsibilities as it relates to the contract. And you want to identify the decision makers. This is also a really good time to either pass out or reference the project roles and responsibilities table.
For the sample contract, we have a fair number of key personnel, so instead of listing those in this section, we're going to refer the meeting attendees to the actual project roles and responsibilities table, and we'll discuss the project roles and responsibilities table in more detail near the end of this training session.
Then we have the acceptable channels of communication section. Don't just think about emails and phone calls here, that you actually, any type of communication is going to happen with a contract, you want to use this section to specify the appropriate method of communication and the appropriate contact, including things like project issues, ad hoc requests, or even scope changes. If you remember back to when you were a kid, or maybe even recently at your job, there's this lovely little game called telephone, where you go around the room and somebody tells the next person next to them something, and it spreads around. And by the time you hit the end, in the majority of cases, what the initial phrase was at the beginning does not match the end. Don't let that happen with your contract. Specify who needs to go through what and when. So for our sample,
We're requiring project issues be directed in writing to Jane and Diane, the day-to-day leaders, and we're specifying scope changes must be presented to the governance committee and submitted in writing to John and Stephen, who are part of each party's executive leadership. We're being very clear that regular project communications must include all involved team members and be sent out via email or meeting minutes. We're also specifying that Alice, a project coordinator, must be included on everything, as she is responsible for maintaining all project documentation.
so then you reach the review of contract requirements section. This is most likely going to take up the bulk of your meeting. But this is vital to ensure that you, your other agency staff, and the contractor all have the same understanding and expectations. It's important to keep in mind that the people who are responsible for negotiating the contracts are probably not going to be the people that you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis. So make sure that you're going through everything in your contract. And you can use this section to touch on the expectations during contract closeout as well. So performance expectations, insurance, bond, audit, these are some of the smaller sections you want to make sure you touch on, but literally everything through the contract you do want to look at. Now, I will give you a point of warning here. The next 4 sections that follow on the agenda are contract requirements as well, but we specifically call out deliverables, delivery requirements, timeline, and the quality assurance plan. So just be careful when filling out the agenda to be sure you're not repeating information.
For our sample, we're going very simple. We're just saying that we're referencing a copy of the contract, and we're going to attach that contract to the agenda. During the meeting, we'll go through the contract section by section, just as you would in a pre-proposal conference. For example, we would go through section 10, which may have the termination options, explaining how the contract may be terminated for cause or for convenience with a 30-day written notice, or for non-appropriation of funds by the legislature.
So then we have the deliverables. And of course, you want to cover what is very kind of self-explanatory here, the deliverables, including things like reports, plans, safety data sheets, goods. You want to specify the frequency, format, and consequences. You also want to specify the service level agreements or performance measures.
Since we're using a staff augmentation contract, the deliverables are weekly status reports and monthly project reports.
Then we have the delivery requirements section. You are going to, in this section, discuss the expectations for delivery requirements, of course, as well as any special situations. So for goods, if you have a situation that might compromise delivery, say your office is in a historic building and you're located on a high floor and you don't have an elevator and the staircase is pretty small, you want to make sure you let your contractor know that if they're trying to deliver something to you. They may require more personnel, they may require some different setups. It may be that the piece of furniture you ordered can't get into your building because of that situation. For services, you want to include work schedule expectations, even the expectations of how a deliverable is going to be delivered, such as through hard copy or a digital file, and you might even discuss the sequence of work to be performed.
In our sample contract, our delivery requirements are specifying that the contractor staff must work 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, between the hours of 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. And they have to be at the office where they are assigned unless they receive prior approval in writing.
So then we have the timeline section on the agenda, where of course you are going to review the project timeline. You're going to include things like decisions, obstacles, or impact on others. Keep in mind this timeline is great, especially if you are doing something that involves an implementation where you might have a go or no-go decision. If you have certain tasks that have to be completed before others, or if you have absolutely firm dates that must be met for things, you'll want to include them in this timeline. It might also include information regarding the timeline for deliverable review and approval.
So our sample timeline section is pretty simple as well. We're just listing the contract term, and we're also noting that detailed timelines may be included in individual assignments.
Then we have the quality assurance plan section, where you're going to discuss what will be inspected and when. You're going to review the monitoring methods, and you'll cover how performance will be evaluated, assessed, documented, and accepted, including any associated risks. If the contract includes liquidated damages or bonding, you'll discuss when and how those requirements may be used. And you'll also discuss who is responsible for each activity and the consequences for poor or non-performance.
Our staff augmentation contract has a quality assurance plan that calls for the state's functional supervisor to review the work performed by the contractor's staff. If the functional supervisor finds errors, the error has to be corrected within 5 business days. And if errors are recurring, they'll be brought to Diane's attention, as she is the contractor's project director. If the same errors continue, the state will request the contract personnel be removed from the project.
So then we have the contract review meeting section. In this section, you're going to talk about your plans for future meetings with the contractor, including how the meeting is going to be conducted, who's going to attend it, where it's going to happen, and when it's going to happen. Now, even if you don't know all of this information just yet, sometimes that's something that's to be determined as the contract evolves and as work on it occurs. You can still schedule what you do know, even if it's only that you know you're going to have a quarterly meeting at your headquarters building.
So for our staff augmentation contract, we're going to hold our meetings quarterly in person at the state's headquarters. They'll start on January 2nd and will occur on the first working day of each quarter at 10 a.m.
Then we have the contract remedies section, and you want to discuss the various contract remedies which will apply to this contract. This includes things such as complaints, which you heard about earlier throughout these training presentations, informal remedies, such as documenting what was discussed, the rationale for resolution, and how the disagreement or controversy was resolved. Now, if you have disputes or controversies with a contract that continue, escalation may occur. If escalation does occur, this can result in a notice of default and a request to cure. It could result in a notice of contract suspension. It could even result in a notice of contract termination.
For our sample contract, we're specifying that all issues will be in writing and that issues may be escalated up to a notice of default and request to cure. If the issues continue, the contract may be suspended or terminated.
So then we have the payment section, where you want to talk about the payment terms, the time frames, and the invoicing expectations. Specifically, if there is a certain format or required attachments that must be included with that invoice. You want to include who the contact is that can speak to non-timely invoices and payments, And if there are Hudson or Veteran Initiative subcontractors, make sure you include language regarding those payments.
This is our payment section for the sample staff augmentation contract. We're requiring invoices on the state-approved format and specifying each invoice must include the number of hours, hourly rate, and name of each contractor staff member who worked on the project. We're also specifying that timesheets must be included within the invoice. Keep in mind, these details must be in the contract itself. This shouldn't be supplemental information.
So now on to the project roles and responsibilities table. So we actually have this document in two different versions. We have a PDF version of it that's fillable. We also made an Excel version because unless you hate Excel, the Excel version is much easier to complete. And so with this table, you want to make sure that you end up with a very comprehensive list that clearly states who is responsible for what. So when you're filling out the table, you want to keep in mind questions like, who do I submit the invoice to at the state? Who do I call with the contractor if there is a discrepancy on the invoice? Who's the contact to schedule a meeting with the CEO at the contractor? Who can send me meeting minutes and action items? Who can give me access to this new system? Who signs off on project implementation so that we can move to go live? Who do I send orders to? Who at the state gets those orders, gets those goods, or the deliverables, the reports? And even, who do I need to send updated bond and insurance information to? You want to make sure you're listing all of the people involved in the project, from the agency head or CEO to the admins working on the project. Be sure you include their names, the agency or company that the individual is employed with, the person's role, again, as it relates to the project. You're not necessarily including their role in their day-to-day job, but their role related to the contract to the project. Their responsibilities related to the project, and feel free to include everything. I highly encourage you include everything because the fields will expand to fit as much information as you need. And be sure you include their email address and telephone number. Keep in mind that you need to update this table throughout the life of the contract, the life of that project, and redistribute it as changes are made. Be sure to list everybody involved, not just those key personnel.
So on our sample contract, this is page 1 of the project roles and responsibilities table. The project responsibilities for an actual project will likely be much more detailed. But as you can see here, we have John Doe as an agency head, Jane Doe as a project lead. We've listed what their project responsibilities are. We have their email addresses and telephone numbers. Then we also have contractor personnel on the bottom half of this page, including the CEO, project director, business director, senior business analyst, and a couple of business analysts as well.
So do we have any questions so far we need to touch on?
Is this for contracts resulting from RFPs or both, on both sides of the house, operations and PC?
This would be used for any contract resulting from an RFP on the purchasing side, on the PC side. And all of the information to fill out this agenda would actually come from that contract.
Okay.
Is this a requirement?
It's not a requirement for most of your PC contracts. It's certainly encouraged because, as we mentioned earlier, it's going to make sure both parties understand what everybody's responsibilities will be, and it will alleviate the potential for any issues that may arise due to misunderstandings.
Oh, wait, Tammy's got another one. So this is after award or prior to beginning of work, and I think, Tammy, we probably answered if it was mandatory. So is it after award or prior to beginning of work?
Yes. So your contract kickoff meeting would occur after you sign the contract and then before the work actually begins. You can actually fold it in. Many agencies, I know, or especially with some of the more detailed contracts or more important contracts, are already holding this meeting. We're just giving it a label here and using some formal documents that will survive along with the contract to make not implementation, but management of the contract much easier.
So thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So, as you may be aware, the Office of State Procurement manages many statewide contracts. We have these kickoff meetings with the contractors as well, but we'll also have agency kickoff meetings as well, which we would invite certain agencies to based on their past usage of that contract. So at these contracts, we'll go over the how to use the contract, including how it's solicited. We'll have description of the products and services available. We'll explain how to find the price. It could be through an e-quote or the vendor website or through MDM and LeGov. Or you could have a price list or a line item, just anything you'll need to know about how you find the cost of whatever you're trying to purchase off our statewide contract. We'll also have the OSP and our contractors' contact information, so you'll know who you need to contact to place your order, and also who you need to contact at OSP if you have any issues or questions about the contract. And we'll also go through on if that particular contract is a lapse contract, or if it's a cooperative contract, mandatory use contract, if there were multiple awards, so there might be contracts with several different vendors for similar items, or whether it's a brand name contract. We'll also discuss any relevant terms and conditions that you may need to know about before you try to use the contract. And finally, we'll go through and explain what we need from you to document the contractor's performance. That's a very slow animation. So, does anybody have any questions about this? Okay.
Thank you all very much. Hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.